Imagine trusting someone you loved, only to discover the terrifying truth: the man you thought you knew was hiding a dark secret. A secret that could cost you everything. This is the true story of Sophie Hartley, her boyfriend's shocking past, the dangerous web of lies he wove, and how one night she had to make a choice that changed her life forever. Stay tuned, because what happens next will leave you speechless. The room was dim, the air heavy with the scent of cheap vanilla candles. They flickered, casting shadows that danced across the peeling wallpaper. Sophie sat on the edge of the couch, her hands gripping her knees. Her breath was shallow, uneven. The quiet hum of the refrigerator in the adjoining kitchen was the only sound. Outside, rain tapped against the window in uneven rhythms, like faint, ghostly knocks. She hated storms, but tonight, the storm was the least of her fears. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table. The sudden vibration made her flinch. Her heart pounded in her chest. She reached for it, her fingers trembling. A text lit up the screen. "Don't look outside." Her stomach twisted. It was from James, her boyfriend. He was supposed to be out of town. She stared at the message, her mind racing. A joke? No. James wasn't the joking type. Her hand hovered over the phone as she typed back, "What's going on?" Seconds felt like hours. Then came another buzz. "Lock the doors." A chill ran down her spine. The windows were already locked. The front door bolted. She stood, her feet sinking into the old carpet, and checked again. Click. Double locked. Triple locked. The rain intensified, pounding harder against the glass. The wind howled, bending the trees outside. Through the curtain's edge, she caught a glimpse of the yard. Dark. Empty. Her chest tightened. The phone buzzed again. This time, she hesitated. She didn't want to read it. Her gut screamed, "Don't." But her fingers moved anyway. "I see him." Her knees almost gave way. She spun around, pressing her back to the wall, clutching the phone like a lifeline. Her thoughts were a mess. See who? Why didn't he call? Why wasn't he here? A sharp crack outside snapped her focus. It sounded like a branch breaking or something heavier. Her pulse thudded in her ears. Footsteps. Faint. Deliberate. On the porch. Her breath caught in her throat. The footsteps paused, right outside the door. She pressed herself tighter against the wall, the cold plaster biting into her back. Her heart pounded so loudly, she was sure whoever it was could hear it. The handle jiggled. Once. Twice. Sophie's mouth went dry. She couldn't move. Her phone buzzed again in her hand, the vibration almost making her drop it. The screen lit up. "Don't make a sound." Tears welled in her eyes. Her legs felt like jelly, but she forced herself to crouch low. Slowly, she crept toward the small side table near the couch. Her fingers fumbled inside the drawer, searching. She felt it cold metal. A pair of scissors. Her only weapon. She clutched them tightly, her knuckles white. The rain continued to hammer against the house, masking the sound of her shallow breathing. The handle jiggled again, harder this time. A low, deliberate knock followed. Knock. 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 Each one was slow, measured, and terrifyingly calm. Her phone buzzed again. She glanced at it, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped it. "I'm sorry." Her blood ran cold. What was he sorry for? What was happening? She typed back quickly, her fingers barely able to hit the right keys. "James, where are you? What's going on?" No response. The knocks came again, louder this time. Her vision blurred with panic. She crawled toward the kitchen, trying to stay out of sight. The scissors were slippery in her damp palm. The knock stopped. Silence. Pure, deafening silence. Then the sound of breathing. Heavy, right outside the door. Sophie froze, her body rigid, every muscle locked in terror. The breathing wasn't just heavy, it was deliberate, slow, menacing. She gripped the scissors tighter, the metal biting into her hand. A sudden scrape echoed through the room. It came from the door. Metal against wood. The sound sent shivers down her spine, sharp and cold. It was like whoever or whatever was outside wanted her to know they were there. Wanted her to feel it. She pressed her back against the cabinet in the kitchen, inching away from the door. Her phone buzzed again. The noise was jarring, almost too loud in the tense silence. She fumbled to mute it, glancing at the screen. It wasn't James. It was an unknown number. Her stomach flipped. She hesitated but opened the message. He's lying. Don't trust him. Her pulse skipped. Who sent this? What did they mean? Her head spun with questions, confusion mixing with fear. The breathing outside stopped. Silence fell again. But not for long. The sharp crack of breaking glass shattered the quiet. Her body jolted. She whipped her head toward the source of the sound. The living room window. The curtains swayed in the wind, the jagged edges of broken glass gleaming in the dim light. She scrambled backward, her breath shallow and panicked. Something or someone had come inside. Her phone buzzed once more, but she didn't look at it this time. She couldn't. Her ears strained, trying to pick up any noise over the rain. The floor creaked softly, just beyond the kitchen. Her chest tightened. She wasn't alone anymore. The creak came again, closer this time. Sophie's hands were slick with sweat, her grip on the scissors faltering. She forced herself to stay low, crawling deeper into the kitchen's shadows. The faint metallic tang of blood hit her nose. She gripped the scissors so hard. The sharp edge had nicked her palm. But she couldn't focus on the pain. She could hear it now. Breathing. Inside. It was slow and raspy, dragging through the air like sandpaper against stone. Her eyes darted toward the darkened doorway leading to the living room. A shadow moved, barely perceptible in the dim light. She stifled a gasp, clamping her free hand over her mouth. Her heartbeat thudded like a drum in her ears, drowning out the storm outside. The figure stopped, lingering just out of sight. She could hear the faint shuffle of their movements, deliberate and predatory. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. The sudden sensation made her flinch. She fumbled to silence it, her fingers trembling. But the damage was done. The shadow turned. She froze, paralyzed by the weight of her own terror. The figure stepped into the doorway. Tall. Motionless. The dim light caught the edge of a face, a mask, pale and featureless, like a blank slate staring back at her. Her breath hitched. They tilted their head, as if studying her, savoring her fear. She felt a scream rising in her throat, but swallowed it down. No sudden moves. Her legs burned from crouching, but she didn't dare shift. The figure raised a hand, gloved and dark, and dragged it along the countertop. The sound was unbearable, a grating scrape that set her teeth on edge. Her phone vibrated again. This time, the figure froze. Their heads snapped toward her pocket, the motion sharp and unnatural. She panicked, bolting to her feet and darting toward the back door. The figure lunged after her, their movements fast, almost inhuman. She reached the door, fumbling with the lock, her bloody hand slipping on the handle. The footsteps closed in. She swung around, the scissors raised. The figure stopped inches from her, the mask emotionless, unyielding. And then, they whispered her name. Sophie. The sound of her name, muffled and distorted, sent chills down her spine. It wasn't just a whisper, it was familiar. The voice slithered through the air like a memory she couldn't place. She froze, the scissors trembling in her grip. The figure tilted its head again, as if amused by her hesitation. The mask remained blank, unchanging, but the way they loomed felt alive, taunting. Rain poured through the broken window behind them, pooling on the floor, the steady drip mixing with the erratic thump of her heartbeat. She swallowed hard, forcing words out of her dry throat. "Who are you?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, they reached up slowly, their gloved fingers grazing the edge of the mask. Sophie's stomach tightened as they began to lift it. The face beneath was revealed inch by inch.
A chin.
A smirk. And then, her breath hitched. It was James, her boyfriend. Her knees buckled, and she staggered backward, pressing herself against the door. No, this isn't happening, she stammered, her voice barely audible over the storm. James didn't move, his smirk twisting into something darker. Why? She croaked, the scissors slipping from her hand and clattering to the floor. He stepped closer, his shoes splashing in the puddles of rainwater. Because you never listened, he said, his voice calm, almost soothing. Her mind raced, fragments of their relationship flashing like snapshots, his controlling remarks, the way he always knew where she was, the times he'd shown up unannounced. It all clicked, and the realization hit her like a punch to the chest.
He had planned this.
All of it. Her phone buzzed again, the vibration rattling against the floor. James glanced at it, his smirk faltering for the first time. Sophie seized the moment, lunging for the scissors. Her fingers wrapped around the handle just as he reached for her. She slashed wildly, the blade catching his arm. He let out a guttural yell, stumbling back, his mask tumbling to the ground. She didn't wait to see what he'd do next. She yanked the door open and ran into the storm, the rain blinding her, her feet slipping on the slick grass. Behind her, she heard him scream her name, but she didn't look back. She couldn't. The rain lashed against Sophie's face, cold and relentless, as she sprinted across the yard. Her bare feet sank into the muddy ground, every step a fight against the earth pulling her down. Branches whipped at her arms as she pushed through the overgrown hedge that lined the backyard. She didn't know where she was going, just that she needed to keep moving. Behind her, James's voice tore through the storm, a twisted blend of rage and desperation. You can't run from me, Sophie. You never could. Her lungs burned, every gasp of air sharp and painful. The faint glow of a neighbor's house appeared in the distance, barely visible through the sheets of rain. It was her only hope. She stumbled forward, her legs trembling, her body on the brink of collapse. The sound of his footsteps grew louder, faster. He was gaining on her. She glanced back for just a second and regretted it immediately. James was close, too close, his face contorted with fury, the rain streaking down his bloodied arm. Her heart surged with panic, but she forced herself to push harder, her body screaming for relief. She reached the edge of the neighbor's property, a low chain-link fence barely visible in the dark. She grabbed it, hoisting herself up, the metal biting into her hands. James was right behind her now. She could feel his presence, his breath cutting through the storm. Just as she swung one leg over the fence, his hand caught her ankle, yanking her back. She screamed, kicking wildly, her free foot connecting with his shoulder. He stumbled, losing his grip for a moment, but it was enough. She threw herself over the fence, landing hard on the wet grass below. Pain shot through her knee, but she scrambled to her feet, adrenaline drowning out the ache. The neighbor's porch light flickered on. A shadow moved behind the curtain, drawn by her screams. Relief flooded her chest, but it was short-lived. James climbed the fence with terrifying ease, his eyes locked on her, unrelenting. Sophie limped toward the house, pounding on the door with everything she had. "Help me, please," she screamed, her voice raw and desperate. The door opened just as James reached her. She spun around, her back to the light, and came face to face with him. His lips curled into a sinister smile. "You think they can save you," he hissed. And then, before she could react, he lunged. Sophie barely had time to react. James slammed into her, his weight knocking her off balance. They hit the wet ground hard, her shoulders striking the porch steps with a sickening crack. Pain radiated through her body, but she couldn't stop to process it. James was on top of her, his hands pinning her wrists to the ground. Rain poured down over both of them, soaking his face, his wild eyes gleaming in the dim light from the porch. She screamed again, thrashing beneath him, but he was too strong. The neighbor stood frozen in the doorway, their face pale with shock. "Call the police," Sophie screamed, her voice breaking. James pressed his forearm against her throat, silencing her, his grip cold and unrelenting. "Stay out of this," he growled at the neighbor, his tone dripping with venom. Sophie clawed at his arm, her nails digging into his skin, but he didn't flinch. She could feel herself losing strength, the edges of her vision blurring. Just when she thought it was over, the neighbor finally snapped out of their stupor. "Get off her," the man yelled, stepping onto the porch with a bat in his hand. James turned his head, distracted for a split second. That was all Sophie needed. With the last of her strength, she wrenched her knee upward, slamming it into his ribs. He let out a grunt of pain, his grip loosening just enough for her to twist free. She rolled onto her side, gasping for air, and crawled toward the steps. The neighbor swung the bat with a sickening crack, catching James across the shoulder. He stumbled backward, rain splashing beneath his feet, but didn't fall. Instead, he turned toward the neighbor, his face twisted in pure rage. "You shouldn't have done that," he hissed, advancing on them like a predator. The neighbor swung again, but James ducked, grabbing the bat mid-swing and yanking it from their hands. Sophie watched in horror as he raised the bat, ready to strike. "No," she screamed, scrambling to her feet, her head spinning from the effort. She lunged forward, grabbing the scissors she had dropped in the chaos. With a primal scream, she drove the blade into his side. James froze, his body stiffening, the bat slipping from his hands. He turned to look at her, his face a mix of shock and something else, betrayal. The rain washed the blood down his side, staining the grass beneath him. He stumbled once, twice, then fell to his knees. For a moment, everything was silent except for the storm. Sophie stood there, trembling, the scissors still clutched in her hand. James looked up at her, his lips moving as if to speak, but no words came. Then he collapsed face first into the mud, motionless. Sophie stood frozen, her breath hitching in shallow gasps. The world seemed to blur around her, rain pelting her skin, the neighbor shouting something she couldn't hear, her heart thundering in her ears. James's body lay crumpled in the mud, the storm washing away the streaks of red pooling around him. Her fingers refused to release the scissors, still slick with his blood. The neighbor ran to her, their hands gripping her shoulders. "Are you hurt? Are you okay?" they asked, their voice panicked. Sophie's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her eyes were locked on James, waiting for him to move, waiting for him to rise again like some unrelenting nightmare. But he didn't. Blue and red lights pierced the darkness, flashing through the rain-soaked yard. A siren wailed in the distance, growing louder, closer. The neighbor must have called them. Sophie's knees buckled, and she sank to the ground, the adrenaline draining from her body all at once. Her whole frame shook violently, her breath catching in broken sobs. The scissors finally slipped from her grasp, landing with a dull thud in the mud. She barely registered the officers rushing toward her, their voices overlapping in a blur. "Ma'am, are you injured? What happened here?" "Someone call for an ambulance." Hands gently guided her to her feet, but she felt weightless, disconnected from her own body. Her gaze flicked back to James one last time. Even now, in death, his face haunted her, eyes half open, lips twisted in an eerie, empty smirk. The officers surrounded him, checking for signs of life, but Sophie already knew. He was gone. Her chest heaved, but relief didn't come. Instead, a heavy emptiness settled over her, cold and unrelenting. James's voice echoed in her mind, a twisted whisper from earlier that night. "You think they can save you?" Even in death, he'd left a mark. And Sophie knew, Deep down, she'd never truly escape him. The ambulance arrived minutes later, its headlights cutting through the rain-soaked chaos. Sophie sat on the neighbor's porch, wrapped in a scratchy blanket an officer had handed her. Her body still trembled, though not from the cold. Her mind felt splintered, stuck on a loop of James's face, the mask, the smirk, the betrayal. Paramedics approached her, their voices soft but clinical. "Ma'am, can you tell us if you're injured?" She shook her head slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm fine." But she wasn't. The pain in her shoulder throbbed with every beat of her heart, and the cut on her palm still oozed blood, mixing with the rainwater dripping from her fingertips. The paramedic glanced at her hand and frowned. "We need to bandage that. It's deeper than you think." She nodded absent-mindedly, her gaze drifting back to the yard. They had moved James's body onto a stretcher, covering him with a black tarp. The sight of it made her stomach churn. It felt surreal, like she was watching someone else's life unfold. The officer who had first arrived crouched beside her, his notepad in hand. "Miss, I know this is overwhelming, but we need your statement. Can you tell us what happened tonight?" Her lips quivered as she tried to find the words. Each detail felt jagged, sharp against her memory. The texts, the mask, the chase through the storm. She spoke slowly, her voice breaking with each sentence. When she got to the part where James had whispered her name, she stopped, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I didn't want to hurt him," she choked out. The officer's expression softened. "You did what you had to do to survive." Survive. The word hung in the air, heavy and foreign. Because even though James was gone, she didn't feel like she'd survived. She felt hollow. The paramedics finished wrapping her hand, and another officer offered to take her to the station. But as Sophie stood, she glanced at the neighbor, her voice trembling. "Thank you," she whispered. The man nodded, his face still pale. "Take care of yourself," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. Sophie followed the officer to the patrol car, the rain finally beginning to let up. The storm outside was ending, but the one inside her was just beginning. As she climbed into the back seat, she looked down at her shaking hands. Even scrubbed clean, she swore she could still see the blood. The patrol car's doors slammed shut with a hollow thud. The engine rumbled to life, and Sophie felt herself being swallowed by the darkness of the car's interior. The city lights blurred past her window, flashing and flickering in the rain-streaked glass. The officer's voice was muffled as he spoke on the radio, but it didn't reach her. She was trapped in a place between numbness and the raw edge of her fear. Her body still shook, despite the blanket draped around her. Her mind kept replaying moments, over and over. James's last look. The blood. Her hands shaking uncontrollably as she pressed the scissors into his side. The sickening feeling of doing what she had to do to survive. The officer turned on the lights as they approached the station, the sound of tires on wet pavement deafening in the stillness. Sophie had never felt more alone. She didn't know if she wanted the questions to stop or if she needed to tell someone everything. She'd been so close to losing herself tonight. Her whole world had been turned upside down, and even though James was gone, the damage he'd done felt like it was still hanging in the air. The car pulled into the police station parking lot, the lights reflecting off the puddles in the driveway. Sophie didn't wait for the officer to open the door. She stepped out on her own, her legs unsteady. The cool night air hit her like a slap, but it didn't make her feel alive. Nothing could make her feel alive again, not after what she'd just done. She followed the officer into the station, her footsteps heavy on the tile floor. As they passed the desks, she noticed officers talking in hushed tones. Her stomach twisted. The officers who had responded to the scene were still talking in the corner, and their hushed words filled the air. Another case like this. Thought she'd be one of those girls who just vanishes. Sophie's head snapped toward them. "What did you say?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. One of the officers glanced over at her, his expression unreadable. "Nothing," he said quickly, but Sophie caught the hint of something in his eyes. Fear?
She didn't know.
But she didn't ask again. Her gut tightened. Something about tonight wasn't finished. Sophie's mind spun as she was led through the sterile corridors of the station. Each step echoed in the silence, the walls closing in around her. She felt small.
Trapped.
The weight of what had happened, what she had done, was beginning to settle in her chest, crushing her with its finality. The officer led her to an interrogation room, cold and clinical, with a single metal chair in the center. She hesitated for a moment before sitting down. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, artificial glow over everything. It was too bright, too sharp. Her skin crawled as she rubbed her arms, trying to chase away the chill that had settled deep inside her. The door clicked shut behind her. A moment later, another officer entered, a woman with sharp eyes and a stern expression. She sat across from Sophie, her gaze piercing. "Miss Hartley," the officer said, her voice smooth but commanding. "I'm Detective Reynolds." Sophie nodded, her throat tight. "You're safe now," Reynolds continued, but the words felt empty. Sophie wanted to believe her, wanted to trust that everything would be okay now that James was gone. But there was something gnawing at her, something that wouldn't let her rest. "Let's go over what happened tonight," Reynolds said, flipping open her notebook. Sophie's thoughts were fragmented as she recounted the events. The texts, the mask, the chase. Her hands shook as she spoke, the memory of James's eyes still haunting her. But something was off. The more she spoke, the more she noticed the way Reynolds was watching her. There was no comfort, no sympathy, only a cold, calculated gaze that never wavered. It made Sophie feel exposed, like she was being sized up, like she wasn't the victim. When she finished her story, Reynolds didn't immediately speak. She simply stared at Sophie for a long moment, her eyes hard. "Miss Hartley," she finally said, her voice colder than before, "are you sure you're telling us everything?" Sophie blinked. "What do you mean?" she asked, the panic creeping back into her voice. Reynolds leaned forward slightly, her fingers tapping against the notebook. "You see, there's something odd about this whole situation," the detective said, her words slow and deliberate. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. Her mind raced, trying to process the implications. "Odd," Sophie repeated, her voice barely a whisper. The detective nodded. James had no criminal record, no history of violence. But we've found something strange in his background. Something that doesn't add up. Sophie's stomach lurched. Her hands trembled in her lap. "What do you mean?" Reynolds didn't answer immediately. She reached into her folder and slid a sheet of paper toward Sophie. It was a picture, a mugshot of a man. A man Sophie didn't recognize. But the name beneath the photo made her blood run cold. James Hartley. It wasn't just James's name. It was a different identity. A name that belonged to someone else entirely. Sophie's breath caught in her throat, her eyes glued to the photograph in front of her. The man in the mugshot was smiling, but it wasn't the familiar smile she remembered from James. His eyes were colder, sharper, empty. The name beneath the photo felt foreign. Aaron Finch. Her hands clenched into fists, the paper crinkling under her fingers. This is a mistake," Sophie stammered, her voice trembling. Detective Reynolds didn't react, just continued to stare at her with that unyielding, calculating gaze. "It's not a mistake," the detective replied. "Aaron Finch is the real name of the man you knew as James Hartley." Sophie's mind spun, and for a moment, everything around her blurred. James, Aaron, wasn't who he had claimed to be.
Who was he?
What had she been living with all this time? What is this?" Sophie whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. "Why didn't I know?" Detective Reynolds leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. "From what we can gather, James Hartley was an alias," she explained. "Aaron Finch went by that name for years, and it's a name with a history." The detective paused, letting the words hang in the air between them. Aaron Finch was involved in some serious criminal activity before he disappeared, Reynolds continued. Drugs, theft, even assault. We believe he changed his identity to start fresh, but the trail didn't disappear entirely. The people who knew him, people he used to work with, they're still out there. And they're not happy that he's gone. Sophie's stomach dropped. Criminal activity? The man she had loved, the man she had trusted, was a criminal? Her mind flashed back to the times when he had been controlling, when he had shown up unexpectedly, when his temper had flared without warning.
It all made sense now.
But it didn't stop the fear from crawling up her spine. Did he know? Sophie whispered, almost to herself. Did he know who he really was? Detective Reynolds didn't answer right away. Her eyes softened for the first time since she'd entered the room. I think he knew more than he let on, Miss Hartley. But I also think you were being manipulated. We've seen cases like this before. People in abusive relationships often don't realize the extent of the lies they're living under until it's too late. Sophie felt the weight of the detective's words sink in, each one like a brick in her chest. She had been lied to for so long. James, or Aaron, had known. He had known exactly what he was doing. And now he was gone. But the fear remained. The question of what would happen next gnawed at her. What happens now? Sophie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Detective Reynolds gave her a grim look. We're going to investigate Aaron Finch's past. Find out who else might be involved. But I need you to understand something. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest. What? She asked, her voice barely a breath. The danger isn't over. People like Aaron don't disappear without a trace. And there are people who will come looking for answers. Answers that you might not want to hear. Sophie's hands gripped the edge of the table. She was in deeper than she had ever realized. And no matter how far she ran, no matter how far she thought she had escaped, she would never be free of the shadows he had cast over her life. Sophie sat in the cold interrogation room, her mind spinning in a haze. Detective Reynolds's words echoed in her ears, but they didn't make sense. The danger isn't over. How could it not be over? James, Aaron, was dead. Wasn't that the end of it? Her body felt heavy, the weight of everything sinking deep into her bones. The officer's warning about people still looking for answers clawed at her thoughts. Who else had he hurt? Who else had he lied to? She couldn't answer those questions. Not yet. But as the minutes dragged on, Sophie's thoughts turned dark, like a storm on the horizon. She knew something had changed. Everything had changed. James had been part of a world she had never imagined, one filled with lies and deception. And now, even though he was gone, that world wasn't going to let her go. The door to the interrogation room opened. Detective Reynolds stepped inside, her expression hard. Miss Hartley, I need you to come with me, she said, her tone no longer as soft as before. Sophie stood, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. Her hands trembled as she followed the detective down the sterile hallway. Every step felt like it was pulling her further into a nightmare. They reached a small office, and the detective motioned for her to sit. Sophie sank into the chair, the weight of everything pressing down on her chest. This is where it gets complicated, Reynolds began. We've discovered something else. Something tied to Aaron Finch's disappearance. Sophie looked up, her pulse quickening. What do you mean? The detective slid a file across the desk. The name on the file made Sophie's blood run cold. Sophie Hartley. Her heart stopped. The detective met her gaze, her eyes filled with a grim understanding. We've just learned that you weren't the first person Aaron Finch manipulated. Sophie's stomach twisted. Her whole life, everything she thought she knew, suddenly felt like a house of cards about to collapse. And the worst part? She had no idea who was coming for her next. Sophie stared at the file in front of her, her mind reeling. Her name was printed there, bold and clear. But it wasn't the first time she'd seen it. Sophie Hartley. The same name that had appeared on the documents she'd found when James, or Aaron, first entered her life. It felt like the ground beneath her was slipping away. Her hand hovered over the file, trembling as if it might burn her to touch it. Detective Reynolds watched her carefully, her expression unreadable. "What is this?" Sophie whispered. The detective didn't answer immediately. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, watching Sophie with quiet intensity. Aaron Finch didn't just adopt the name James Hartley for a fresh start, Reynolds said slowly. He wasn't just trying to outrun his past. He had a pattern, a type of person he targeted. And you fit that pattern? Sophie's throat tightened. Pattern? She asked, her voice strained. The detective opened the file, revealing a series of photos. Photos of other women. Each woman had the same vacant expression Sophie had seen in the mirror every time she questioned herself. Each woman had been taken in by the charm of a man who wore a mask so well, no one could see past it. We believe Aaron Finch used different identities to infiltrate the lives of vulnerable women, creating relationships that seemed real. But they were never real. It was all manipulation, control. Sophie couldn't breathe. Her hands clenched into fists, the truth hitting her like a wave. Had she been just another pawn in his twisted game? Are you telling me I wasn't the first? Sophie's voice cracked. No, Reynolds replied softly. You weren't, but you're the one who survived. You're the one who broke free. Sophie's heart pounded. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt something shift inside her. The weight of the past few days, of the betrayal, of the terror, began to lift, just a little. It wasn't over. There were still questions. Still people out there, waiting for answers. But Sophie had taken back control. She wasn't a victim anymore. She wasn't going to be his next mark. She looked up at Detective Reynolds, her eyes clearer now. Then what happens now? Reynolds gave her a small, knowing smile. Now we make sure no one else falls into his trap. Sophie nodded, a deep, quiet resolve settling in her chest. For the first time, she was ready to face whatever came next. And this time, she wouldn't be alone.